First of all, I'll start with a word of welcome on my own behalf. Bienvenue à tous et à tous qui sont venus ici aujourd'hui pour cette présentation très, très intéressante. J'aimerais commencer par m'introduire. Je m'appelle Christina Huneau. Je suis la directrice de programme interuniversitaire en histoire de l'art. I'm also the Associate Dean, Faculty Relations for the Faculty of Fine Arts at Concordia University. I would like to begin this session as I did last time by thanking Diogo for all of the work that he has done as organizer of our speaker series. Mais j'aimerais aussi dire un mot à nos étudiants pour l'année prochaine. Pour l'année prochaine, on va commencer à discuter dans notre comité quelle sera la forme que les étudiants aimeraient proposer pour une participation dans la programmation intellectuelle de notre programme. So if you would like to take over the organization of the speaker series, or if you would like to suggest something else for next year, a different kind of series, a colloquium instead of a speaker series, or a publication, anything that would contribute to our intellectual life as a program, I would really encourage you to be in touch with your student representative on the Inter-University PhD Committee. Bon, alors, je vais commencer avec la reconnaissance territoriale. Je l'ai en français ici, mais aussi je vais le verbaliser en anglais. I want to begin by acknowledging that our 3 universities are situated on unceded Indigenous land. And also by recognizing the Kanien'kehá:ka Nation as the traditional custodians of the lands and waters on which we work. Now, Tiohtià:ke, or Montreal, is not only Kanien'kehá:ka territory. Historically, it's noticed and recognized as a gathering place for many different First Nations. And today, it continues to be a home to a diverse population of Indigenous and other peoples. We respect the continuing connections with the past, present, and future in our ongoing relationships with Indigenous people in the Montreal community. And of course, not everybody who's with us today is in Montreal. Alors, j'encourage tout le monde, n'importe où dans le monde où vous êtes situé, de penser et respecter les connexions qui continuent avec les communautés autochtones, n'importe où que vous soyez situé. Alors, je vous remercie et Diogo, c'est tout pour moi, je pense.
Thank you, Christina. So this is the second talk of our speaker series, What Art Histories for Present Times? Quelles histoires de l'art pour le temps présent? J'aimerais juste remercier, avant de commencer, donc Christina Huneau, Ersi Contogouris, Christine Tanton et Anna-Laïs Alvarez-Hernandez pour le soutien avec l'organisation. Aussi Eddie Firmin, qui est le responsable pour l'identité visuelle de la série et qui a aussi cédé les droits de son œuvre qui est sur l'affiche. Merci aussi à Roxane Mallet qui m'aide avec le Zoom, à Benoit Jodoin qui est notre répondant. Et surtout, thank you, Tom Holert, for accepting to speak to us today. Benoit.
Thank you, Diogo. Bonjour à toutes et à tous. I have the pleasure to introduce our guest for today, Mr. Tom Holert. So Tom Holert works as a cultural theorist, art historian, curator, and occasional visual practitioner. In 2015, he co-founded the Harun Farocki Institute, an archive, research, and facilitating platform on visual politics, documentary education, and moving images in Berlin. Recent book publications include Neolithic Childhood Art in a False Present circa 1930 with Anselm Franke, a catalog reader supplementing the 2018 exhibition of the same title at the Haus der Kulturen der Welt in Berlin. Also knowledge beside itself, contemporary arts epistemic Politics at Steinberg Press 2020. And upcoming Politics of Learning, Politics of Space, Architecture, and the education shock of the 1960s and 70s. So thank you, Mr. Holert, for accepting our invitation. Maybe I'll point out already that our virtual audience don't have to wait till the end of your presentation to ask questions. They can use the conversation space to write their questions as at the moment that they pop really. And also, well, Diogo, Roxanne, and I will help translated questions are written in French. So without further ado, I will now hand it over to Mr. Holert, who will present his conference called Contemporary Arts, Epistemic Politics.
Thank you very much and welcome to everyone. Happy New Year. Thank you in particular, Diogo and Benoit, for inviting me and Christina and the entire program to host this event. The program appears to me highly interesting, and also the way in which it is or the fact that it is organized from students, from the PhD candidates, is something that needs to be in a way transplanted to German universities as well, much more. I prepared a talk which will last about 30 minutes, and it will be rather theoretical in nature. I will touch on some of the issues I'm raising in the book Knowledge Beside Itself, Contemporary Arts, Epistemic Politics, from which subtitle I took the title for this conference, for this talk. And one of the key things I had to acknowledge, since it has been published in late spring this year, is that of course it lacks any. It lacks any reference, any reflection of the current situation, and it also with which I mean both the way in which the COVID-19 phenomenon, the pandemic, is raising constantly on a constant basis issues of questions of knowledge, it's also being framed and rendered as a genuinely epistemological challenge, and which is in a way feeding into a sense of a more general or larger epistemological crisis that is being linked to phenomena such as Trumpism, neo-fascism, the far right, and its particular idea or particular relationship to knowledge, truth claims, fake news, etc. So when the book came out, this was, it could have been predicted, it could have been anticipated by myself in a much more, in a stronger sense than I actually finally did it in the book, whose manuscript I finished early in 2019. But I think it is also in a way some of the thoughts which are to be made right now are in a way prefigured by what I've trying to do in the book in relation to to contemporary art and its epistemic politics. And in the book, what I attempt is to render in a series of case studies structured according to certain thematic emphasis, the significance of the convergences of contemporary arts and fields and practices of knowledge supposedly located outside the realm of art, and how these convergences have assumed kind of importance and required attention in recent decades. I do not want to and cannot reproduce the various lines and layers of this account in detail here, but I would like to refer to a few central points from which the transition to the current situation could then be made. In the month following a similarly drastic caesura as the Corona crisis, after the ground zero created by the event of September 11, 2001, and on the most diverse levels of geopolitics, society, law, and culture, but also in the most diverse places in the world, the various platforms of Documenta 11 of 2002 were organized. Arguably, Documenta, arguably the largest event organized regularly to showcase contemporary art since it was founded in the West German city of Kassel in the post-Second World War 1950s. Okwui Enveso, the visionary artistic director of the 2002 edition of Documenta, who died last year, had conceived a project together with his team of co-curators that was decidedly oriented towards the introducing and integration of the insights of post-colonial theory in the curatorial apparatus of contemporary art, and was to be organized with the programmatic, at times polemical recognition of non-Western knowledge systems. Contemporary visual art, the declared object of Documenta since the 1950s, was now considered as a mode of knowledge production, and Documenta itself and the individuals and institutions involved in it were framed in terms of knowledge capital, for example. Images of visitors reading and discussing in exhibition spaces at this point had become quite familiar in contemporary art contexts, organized and displayed, and in conceptualist strands of the art world, where interest in a discursivized take on political and social issues prevailed. With Documenta 11, this understanding of art as an epistemic activity, as a place where knowledge processes are being triggered, shaped, and redistributed, was implemented in a particularly programmatic way in the perception of a broader public. Also, in retrospect, Enveso emphasized that his Documenta had been a decidedly epistemological undertaking, not least in view of the incisive impact of the September 11 attack the year before. I'm quoting Enveso in 2018. The events of September 11 in the United States indeed have provided us with a metaphor for articulating what is at stake at the radical politics and experimental cultures of today, while opening a space from which culture, qua contemporary art, could theorize an epistemology of non-integrative discourse. The metaphor of September 11 is to be found in the stark notion of ground zero, but what does ground zero mean at that moment it is uttered? Where do we now locate the space of ground zero? What constitutes its effects on the nature of radical politics and cultural articulations today? These are all factors that affected our organization of Documenta 11, end of quote. It is noticeable how closely the tone of this statement resembles much of what has been read and heard in recent months in view of the paradigmatic shifts entailed by the pandemic. The talk of a historical moment that in hindsight has to appear inevitable and which would fundamentally change the essence of radical politics and cultural articulations. For the moment, however, I would like to concentrate on Enveso's remark, according to which the events of September 11 contributed to an opening in which, above all, contemporary art as an element of culture in general can become an agent of an emphatically theoretical intervention, an agent in the service of a shift in thinking and knowledge towards an epistemology of a non-integrative discourse. What Enveso meant by that, if I read it correctly, was a type of knowledge and knowing that renounces the epistemic bias of an integrative, that is, universalist Western modernity, and thereby asserts an autonomy exactly in a militant non-integration and heterogeneity the kind of which occurs at about the same time in a different language game, stressing the necessity of a de-linking, of a decolonial decoupling from the Occidental systems of philosophy and science. Particularly remarkable in Enveso's statement seems to me the emphasis and matter of coarseness with which he aligned art and epistemology, less with regard to the relationship between art and science that, as we know, has existed for a long time and continues to exist, and not even so much with regard to how art or individual artworks produce and maintain specific forms and modalities of knowledge, both in their making and in their reception, but in a way that moves beyond these questions, namely in considering the impact of the global operation that is running under the name contemporary art, with its growing economic leverage and social prestige, exerts when it comes to the structuring, designing, and organization of epistemic practices, of transdisciplinarity, of the critique of science, but also of new types of pedagogy and performativity with regard to knowledge. And all this on a global scale. I share the intuition expressed in this view, and I try to elaborate on it in Knowledge Beside Itself, because contemporary art as a sector, a department, an area of contemporary culture at large, has spawned an ever-growing panoply of media and formats, expanding on the classic formats such as the exhibition, the framed image, the installation, the performance, the catalog, the guided tour, to implement the discussion event, the lecture, the seminar, the temporary academy, the one-year project, the interinstitutional collaboration, etc. A panoply that has broadened for about 3 decades, well beyond a previously known and somehow expected and tolerated level of discursiveness and theoreticity in art. So again, what exactly is contemporary art's relation to knowledge? Philosopher Peter Osborne posits a shift since the 1970s from knowledge to art, from modern knowledge's claims to objectivity to contemporary art's embodiments of subjectivity. The latter, in his view, has a more intimate relationship to historical temporality and thus would register more sensitively the changes within contemporary capitalist formation. Attending to this shift, Osborne holds, could enable one to, I quote, to grasp the most distinctive cultural features, that is, the lived novelty of our historical present. End of quote. A somewhat baffling counter-Hegelian idea, it intimates that the notorious end of art, its transference into our ideas instead of maintaining its earlier necessity and reality and occupying its higher place, which is a quote from Hegel, is to be reversed in order to gain insight into the current situation. However, Osborne maintains that the so-called knowledge economy undoubtedly involves transformations in the relations and practices of art and knowledge. These changes render the transcendental constitution of art and knowledge as separate value spheres increasingly phantasmatic. End of quote. The knowledge economy is to be placed in the context of the new art industry, which thrives on the changed conditions of the culture industry that Osborne maintains, quote, no longer only makes mass products, but exhibits a highly sophisticated differentiation into market sectors, including, paradoxically, autonomous art, for which it is now the distributive mechanism. End of quote. In this view, the expanding habitat of global biennial culture hosts and stimulates the trans-categorial artistic practices symptomatic of the ontological transformation of art under the impact of globalization and digitization and the ensuing mutations of the culture industry. Moreover, the processes of translation and transculturation, characteristic of the current exhibitionary apparatus, are mirrored by far-reaching reconfigurations of the art-knowledge compound, reconfigurations that are arguably caused and shaped by the demands of the knowledge economy. Displaying and performing knowledge has entailed an almost complete makeover of art institutions, exhibitions, biennials, and art schools curricula since the 1990s, coinciding with the rapid global expansion defining contemporary art. Contemporary art has indeed become much more transdisciplinary since the dissolution of boundaries in the neo-avant-gardes of the 50s and 60s inspired Theodor Adorno to speak of the fraying of modernist artistic mediums and genres. Fraying, however, is not to be confused with the radical dissolution of value spheres such as art and knowledge or aesthetics and science registered by Osborne. What exactly has been overcome or left behind in this development? Let's quickly recall how Jürgen Habermas separated value spheres or knowledge systems and conceived the relation of art, aesthetics, and knowledge, science, for instance, in his model of aesthetic practical rationality. At the core of Habermas's thinking in the 70s and 80s, most coherently presented in his 1981 book, The Theory of Communicative Action, was the concept of the logic of cultural rationalization that marked what he calls cultural modernity. Habermas asserts that the specific function performed by autonomous art in the face of a subjectivity that is decentered and removed from the spatio-temporal structures of everyday life is to express authentic human needs by evading the epistemic hold of expert cultures and to cultivate the independent logic of the aesthetic. The epistemological status of art, to be retrieved by art criticism, made Habermas believe that a pragmatic logic of argumentation is the most appropriate guiding thread through which the aesthetic practical type of rationality can be differentiated over and against other types of rationality. This rationality would make validity claims inherent in works of art identifiable, claims that are, however, of a different order than normative claims in regulative speech acts. Therefore, what is required is, via Habermas, a proper model for the relation between the potential for truth of works of art and the transformed relations between self and world stimulated by aesthetic experience. Habermas refers to a post-avant-garde marked by the coexistence of tendencies toward realism and engagement with those authentic continuations of modern art that distilled out the independent logic of the aesthetic. He sees moments of the cognitive and the moral practical in play in contemporary art. It seems, he writes, as if the radically differentiated moments of reason want in such counter movements to point toward a unity, not a unity that could be had at the level of worldviews, but one that might be established this side of expert cultures in a non-reified communicative everyday practice. End of quote. It is, of course, this claim of an ontological unity or pre-linguistic, if symbolically mediated consensus that has elicited massive criticism of Habermas' position, especially by Jean-François Lyotard. In the French philosopher's 1979 book, The Postmodern Condition, first published as a report commissioned by the government of Quebec, titled The Problems of Knowledge in the Most Developed Industrial Societies, Lyotard rendered a somewhat different role for art in emerging knowledge economies. It is well known that Lyotard considered the decline of the grand Enlightenment narratives of philosophical speculation and political emancipation as typical of the postmodern condition. His observation of a shift of emphasis from the ends to the means of actions, from the art of storytelling to the terror of performativity, that is, knowledge production's imperative of effectiveness, in many respects resembles the Habermasian critique of functionalist reason in late capitalism. With regard to the roles of culture and art, however, they pursue very different agendas. Though Lyotard does not discuss aesthetic matters directly in the postmodern condition, he provides an implicit sketch of the potential function and form of art in a knowledge economy context devoted to the fulfillment of state and corporate demands for performance and effectiveness. Lyotard's ultimate vision of science and knowledge, to oppose the rule of effectiveness and capitalist productivity, was one of, quote, a search not for consensus, but very precisely for instabilities as a practice of paralogism, in which the point is not to reach agreement, but to undermine from within the very framework in which the previous normal science had been conducted. In Lyotard's book, paralogism serves as a stand-in for the heteromorphy of language games, for a deviant epistemic practice, for a disruption of research routine, for the contingency of social pragmatics. The paralogical may become a driver of innovation in science, the kind of rupture both feared and desired by the epistemic powers to be, but it also sketches the outline of a politics that would respect both the desire for justice and the desire for the unknown. The subjects or agents of a politics of the paralogical are of molecular stature, smaller narratives, minorities, the disempowered. Linking the desires for justice and for the unknown, the libidinal silhouette of such political agency becomes apparent as a moral epistemic project. In the 1980s, Lyotard revamped Kant's concept of the sublime to distinguish between a modernist and a postmodernist sublime, the latter offering none of the pleasure and solace of the former. He furthermore proposed a disturbance of modernist temporality and a delinking of authorial time from the time of the aesthetic event. Anticipating Osborne's notion of the post-conceptual as the category of art that has to render the concept of art from scratch in each work, Lyotard sees the postmodern artist or writer in, I quote, the position of a philosopher. The text he writes, the work he, the he of course is also a she. The work he produces are not in principle governed by pre-established rules, and they cannot be judged according to a determining judgment by applying familiar categories to the text or to the work. Those rules and categories are what the work of art itself is looked for. The artist and the writer then are working without rules in order to formulate the rules of what will have been done. End of quote. The actual capitalist reality of such knowledge production on the side of art practitioners, however, appears much less eventful, far from any experience of the sublime. Rather than fostering conditions for the sublime, the principles of effectiveness of the postmodern knowledge economy have come to colonize the realm of art and aesthetic reflection. The English translation of Lyotard's essay introduces the term artistic research for the first time to describe the dependencies of the artist conceived as knowledge producer. I quote again, Lyotard, artistic and literary research is doubly threatened, once by the cultural policy and once by the art and book market. What is advised, sometimes through one channel, sometimes through the other, is to offer works which, first, are relative to subjects which exist in the eyes of the public they address, and second, works so made, well made, that the public will recognize what they are about, will understand what is signified, will be able to give or refuse its approval knowingly, and if possible, even to derive from such work a certain amount of comfort. The objects and the thoughts which originate in scientific knowledge and the capitalist economy convey with them one of the rules which supports their possibility, the rule that there is no reality unless testified by consensus between partners over a certain knowledge and certain commitments. End of quote. To escape this conception of the knowledge economy and the functionality of artistic research and development, as responding to expectations and demands surrounding what is known and knowable, Lyotard turns to the sublime and thus to a category or a sentiment that, quote, takes place when the imagination fails to present an object which might, if only in principle, come to match a concept, end of quote. The refusal of knowledge and representation, both of which Lyotard associates with the classical pre-Kantian concept of the perfectly beautiful, emerges as the ultimate aesthetic politics. Another quote, we can conceive the infinitely great, the infinitely powerful, but every presentation of an object destined to make visible this absolute greatness or power appears to us painfully inadequate. Those are ideas of which no presentation is possible. Therefore, they impart no knowledge about reality, experience. They also prevent the free union of the faculties which gives rise to the sentiment of the beautiful, and they prevent the formation and the stabilization of taste. They can be said to be unpresentable. End of quote. The limit rendered here by Lyotard is the same that has been invoked more recently on the unknowability of current algorithmic governmentality, for example. However, Habermas's and Lyotard's thinking of the distinctiveness of aesthetic cognition in the face of an expansion of the knowledge beyond representation may work as a reminder of the epistemological and ontological issues at stake in contemporary art's epistemization. The more contemporary art is accounted for and addressed as a platform, system, or institutional space of research, investigation, epistemological speculation, and decolonial struggles for the recognition of subaltern, Black, feminist, queer, indigenous, and other marginalized yet powerful modes of knowing and thinking, the more it is confronted with the task of understanding its own roles in the general intellect's current manifestations. In other words, contemporary art must not only be seen as an increasingly important factor in the reorganization of ideas about what it means for people to know, to theorize, to philosophize, to research, to learn, etc., to, in a way, to be seen as a kind of onto-power, but also as an agent, maybe particularly apt of rendering palpable the shifts and makeovers of the past, present, and future tectonics of knowledge, or rather knowledges. This is, of course, a somewhat bold claim, and it is based even less on long-term empirical research than on impressions that anyone can collect who engages, even rudimentary, with the communication and the pedagogy of art, with its topics, contents, and concerns, with contemporary art's increasing presence in the human sciences, etc. After all, an increase in the economic importance of contemporary art can be proven relatively easily on the basis of the ever larger number of people who participate in contemporary art worldwide, both producing and consuming, as visitors to exhibitions and museums, as cultural tourists, as students, as teachers, as speculators and investors, as intermediaries or other employees in art institutions, foundations, universities, or in publishing houses, as engineers and producers of works of art and exhibitions, and this list goes on. As well as in view of the ever higher budgets, profits, and sales that can be expected directly or indirectly to be made in and through contemporary art. The thus broadly outlined economic expansion of contemporary arts finds its counterpart in an ever greater symbolic meaning, a growing attractiveness and pull of the entire field as a social and economic realm, which is reflected in the tendencies mentioned above. And this pertains to places spread around the world where the economic conditions as well as the supply of education and access to it are sufficiently secure to allow for the creation and maintenance of scenes, institutions, and markets of art. This basic supply of work and income is crucial because large parts of the art system are effectively decommodified and do not guarantee any income that can be counted in money. In other words, the production of art is increasingly removed from the logic of the market, and only very few players are able to make a living by selling works of art. In turn, they appear to be all the more liberated, or rather forced, to set up their artistic practice as independent of the production of physical objects, and instead to classify them into categories of social practice, research, processuality, etc. In her book, Wages Against Artworks, in previous texts, the cultural critic Leclerc Laberge relays the notion of decommodification via the field of art. The term decommodification originates in a Scandinavian theory of the welfare state, in which certain benefits are withdrawn from the market. By applying it to types of art that are committed to a practice of social change, Laberge can expand the term into the neologism decommodified labor, somewhat synonymous with decommercialized labor. I also consider this conceptual twist to be helpful in order to be able to understand and detach more effectively the question of the relationship between knowledge and art from a more traditional philosophical debate about aesthetics, ontology, and epistemology. I share with Carrie Lambert-Beatty, for example, a certain allergy when it comes to classical epistemology and its ontological pursuits with regard to art and knowledge of thinking. I'd rather prefer an analysis of art and knowledge not only in terms of or to be exerted not only in terms of a social epistemology attentive to actual behavior, but to Marxist or post-Marxist political economy. As already indicated, I'm also less interested in the proof of something like a particular epistemic power of art or in the specificities of artistic knowledge. Rather, I want to look into the functionality and operability of the complex of contemporary art with regard to the change of knowledge and epistemological concepts, and thus, according to the transformation theory, for example, to comprehend social change as a whole. Decommodified labor, this term is also not far removed from that of dematerialized art, as it was coined in the late 1960s by Lucy Lippard to denote new, increasingly conceptualistic, theory-based practices. From here, a sometimes straight, sometimes crooked line leads to the immaterial arts in the computer age that Jean-François Lyotard chose as the subject of his legendary 1987 exhibition Les Immatériaux at the Centre Pompidou in Paris, and to the immaterial labor of post-Fordist societies, but which in turn can only reductively be related to concepts such as knowledge society or knowledge economy. Laberge introduces a concept of decommodified labor as follows, I quote, "Many people, particularly those in the culture industries, now work longer days for more years, and they receive a steady reduction in the money they are offered in return. I call this slow diminishment of the wage alongside an increase in the demands of work decommodified labor. I argue that the turn of socially engaged art toward function, this art's seeming abandonment of autonomy, is grounded in the decommodification of labor. I orient my readings of such art within the hermeneutics of the commodity form, its constitutive obfuscation of labor in particular, and I suggest that decommodified labor has reconstituted what kind of claims can be made on the aesthetic and what kind of practices may be understood as art practices." End of quote. For Laberge, commodification and decommodification are not descriptive, judgmental categories. Decommodification is not good per se, even if it can lead to interesting and progressive aesthetic and social practices. Rather, both processes have become increasingly interdependent under the influence of developments such as financialization of the economy and of the everyday life, the decoupling of large areas of artistic work from the remaining elements of wage labor, for example, in exchange networks inspired and organized by artists, can be read as a freely chosen exit from capitalist exploitation, but just as well as a necessary development that is more likely related to the constitutive role of unpaid, feminized housework and reproductive labor in all stages of capitalism. This means that knowledge work, which is increasingly playing a central role in art, which is expected, prized, and marketed by institutions, is often enough also decommodified. But that does not mean that it would cost nothing or hasn't already been charged for. On the contrary, expensive art programs that force their graduates into debt, who are thus being forced to pay off the price attached to their degree, are decisive elements of the fact that the critical theoretical work, the knowledge production, which is not least linked to diplomas or doctorates at art universities, is firmly integrated in the logics of financialization that determine both the economies of knowledge and that of art. The more the preoccupation with knowledge, science, research, which can even equate art with research-based practices, presents itself as a double involvement in the financialization of knowledge on the one hand and in the critical decommodification of knowledge work on the other, it seems urgently required to politicize this connection as such, that is, to construct a framework of knowledge political analysis for the art-knowledge complex. There are several levels to be considered. In a nutshell, On the one hand, the level of critical and institutional critical knowledge about art and its political and economic embeddings and functions, not least in the light of its being a relatively new actor in an increasingly transdisciplinary or post-disciplinary landscape of science. The other level would be that of an interest in, or rather an often almost extractive capture of non-scientific, non-Western, non-white, non-hegemonic systems of knowledge and belief by the system of contemporary art. In other words, or more precisely, its protagonists, or more art, or more precisely, its protagonists, institutions, its formal and informal economies and pedagogies, becomes a place where knowledge itself is supposedly experimentally expanded and made available. And quite considerable is the authority or cultural capital that this system, distributed widely through independent para-academies and biennials, self-organized networks and large museum institutions, has accumulated since the 1990s. Where should new knowledge arise with which seemingly unknown, unexpected crises can be adequately processed and mastered? In view of the massive epistemological crisis of which the economist Philip Mirovsky or the historian Gilles Lepore and others speak, in the face of neoliberalism, Trumpism, and an emerging COVIDism, the sciences are in great demand, but they have also been called into question like probably never before since the 19th century. Here, contemporary art offers itself again and again in the most varied of coalitions and constellations as an alternative source of knowledge, wherever factions of it organize as a globally distributed counter-academy, it may be exactly the supposed weakness resulting from an increasing detachment from the market that is the position of an increasingly decommodified knowledge work practiced as aesthetic practice that could act as an authority in matters of epistemic politics. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Holert. Thank you for this presentation. I really appreciate the fact that you made the effort to suggest some connections between your book and well, the news, really, what's going on right now. I think it's very interesting to think about the connections. I'll repeat that we will take all the questions in the written form in the conversation part of the Zoom platform, but also you can use the raise your hand button. We obviously have questions, but I'd rather start your discussion with all the member of the audience and have your views on that matter. Maybe I would ask the first question. It seems to me that you make the distinction between, to say really maybe naively, between knowledge and thought, and that knowledge would be somehow related to the idea of, like you said, of something that is productive, that is useful in the neoliberal sense of the term, and thought maybe something that would be a tool somehow to resist the expertise culture you mentioned, that is non-reified, that can undermine from within, that can be deviant epistemic practices. Is this distinction between knowledge and thought somehow useful to think about a way art could get involved into epistemic politics without ruining its independence and without asking artists to become mere cultural producers?
Yes, thank you for this question, which is, of course, I mean, which points at a crucial distinction, which I'm turning my head around for quite a while, which is not really easy to grasp, also in more traditional philosophical and epistemological frameworks. There has been, to narrow it down a little bit, there has been quite some discussion around questions of art as knowledge production and artistic research or research-based art practices about this particular distinction you've been mentioning. Simon Sheikh, for example, some years ago was kind of emphasizing the need to differentiate between the commodity of knowledge, or knowledge as commodity, and thinking as something which is maybe a way out of the commodifying logics of contemporary knowledge economies or cognitive capitalism. In a way, this distinction, or this difference has since in the past years, in the discussions around the relationship between art and knowledge, been in a way reintroduced into the debate. So it's not, in a way, it's part of also the strategies of legitimizing or selling programs, for example, of research-based art and the respective degrees. There is that thinking is to be valued higher necessarily because knowledge is the bad commodity. It's turning, or is leaning towards its own commodification, whereas thinking is in a way the more kind of, I mean, the natural ground on which art needs to be made and raised. And I'm a bit doubtful of this. I mean, I'm not sure whether this distinction really leads beyond the kind of binaries, the kind of dualisms that are in a way structuring the field anyway. And I'd be more interested in this case having a closer look at the very functions that the trope of thinking and thought, in contradistinction to knowledge, is fulfilling right now in the way in which a discourse around knowledge-based or research-based practices is developing.
Mm-hmm. And also, I really found it was quite interesting that you point out sort of the materialistic context in which the thought process exists. And so who bears the rent while we're giving ourselves some time to have long-term discussions?
Yes.
And maybe to take part in some educational platforms or diplomas or programs that do not deserve any diplomas, right? That there's needs to have space, but there are still bills to pay, and so there's this materialistic point that does not only apply, I think, to knowledge, but also to thought processes.
Yeah.
Thank you for that. We have a question from Dr. Uno. So in the wake of the post-truth events playing out south of the Canadian border, I'm wondering whether Tom Holert has any ideas about art's relation to truth as a part of a knowledge system. Is there a productive way to think about art's relation to truth without returning us to romantic or universalizing frameworks beyond perspectivism and a plurality of truths?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think also, thank you for this question. I think it also makes us aware, I mean, of the kind of the matter of causes, or the self-evidence with which certain also moral judgments about certain, I mean, qualities or certain characteristics of knowing and or ignorance, knowledge and ignorance need to be reassessed. There is, of course, I mean, I think there are good reasons to apply certain kind of concepts, certain notions developed in social epistemology, in this kind of subsection of social epistemology called virtue epistemology, onto onto the way in which knowledge is being framed and reframed via artistic practices of knowing differently, or knowing or going beyond certain kind of normative ideas of how truth is to be rendered, or how truth is to be arrived at. There is, of course, I mean, with looking at the US in the moment, or not only the US, I mean the entire spectrum of the far right on a global scale is operating very effectively and very recklessly in the realm of epistemology and epistemic, in the reordering and reconfiguration of epistemic orders, and the way in which ignorance or epistemic arrogance or epistemic violence is has become part and parcel of right-wing discourse is something to be reckoned with, or is to be dealt with, I guess, or I think, in contemporary arts, in ways that doesn't have to be that much different from, or doesn't need to be that different from the kind of reflections made in other sciences, in other disciplines. I mean, there are as a purveyor, as a protagonist of knowledge systems, and as a kind of ontological actor in this respect, is kind of constantly teaming up, knowingly or unknowingly, with other disciplines that have in which center the question of truth or knowledge lies. And I think the way in which art has developed an entire repertoire, I mean modernist art in particular, but I mean art in general, of course, over the centuries, of using kind of fiction, ambiguity, parafictions, mock documentaries, etc., to point at the way, first of all, how knowledge claims are being construed and can be also deconstructed then, and how this how kind of alternative ways of processing reality can or could look like. But this is probably not exactly, I mean, the answer to your question, but it's I wouldn't say that art is a privileged, or is an exceptional place to make any definition of what truth may be.
I think, I think that it's quite a tricky question, because artistic research tend to promote ideas like going beyond neutrality, objectivity, like you just mentioned, mixing truth with fiction, with imagination. There is this intention of developing other ways of knowing, more subjective, personal, creative, free. I know that it's sort of a hard question to answer, but is this a sort of a slippery slope? Are we, by promoting this sort of alternative epistemology, heading in the same direction as some people who are defending ideas like alternative facts or fake news, or other sort of alt-right epistemological interpretation of truth?
Yeah, in the view of, I mean, with an interest to devaluate or to deflate any engagement of art with knowledge, this would be, of course, the most easiest argument to make. I mean, it's if you are, I mean, structurally analogous to, I mean, what you're doing is structurally analogous to what the manufacturers of alternative facts are doing. But I think there's also, I mean, you have to, one has to first one has to consider the kind of non-linearity and non-linearities of these, or the causalities of these developments. The right-wing far-right epistemologies are in a way vampirizing on avant-gardist and conceptualist methodologies to a large extent, which you can I mean, you can see this in Russia. You can see it in the way in which some of the kind of pranks of the yes men are being in a way doubled or kind of paraphrased by right-wing trolls and image boards lets one question whether there's also something like an interest of the right wing in kind of producing or using methodologies or using procedures developed in the arts for their own causes. And of course, I mean, this cannot mean that I think this doesn't cast only or this not only makes art suspicious in this respect, ideologically unsound or unreliable, but it also, but you should be, but I think this is a wake-up call to look much more closely, or even more closely and more with much more differentiation on these on the kind of on the differences between say the parafictions offered by something like Walid Rad's Atlas Group and the parafictions produced by whatever right-wing platform, and because there are differences, of course. There are not only differences in intention and in the good, in the well-meaning or well of what is done on the one hand, but there are also I think crucial distinctions to be made in the finer textures of those practices, knowledge practices, and therefore I would always as a first reflex say, well, yes, the suspicion needs to be, or the question needs to be raised. The suspicion might be legitimate, but on first sight. But then you have to look closer.
Mm. Yeah, I think I understand your point. What you say is yes, but at least we problematize it. Is that a good? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. It's very interesting. I wanted also, if there's any other questions from the public. I wanted to come back to the question of decolonization that you mentioned in your presentation. Of course, this is one of the most important issues, if not the most important issue right now in the field in Canada. So we are in the middle of an important and much needed conversation about this subject. And yeah. I think it is quite obvious to say that decolonization also involved decolonization of knowledge. Of course, there's growing consensus about the need to make room for indigenous ways of knowing, to give some space to authors and writers coming from the South, also to maybe let go of some of that Western philosophy and diverse a little bit our thought traditions. My question would be, can you, well, how does that concern art? What would be the role of artists and institutions to try to go towards that direction and to try to offer something to that political project much needed right now?
Mm. Yeah, thank you, Benoit. I think, again, it's one of those very delicate questions. there's a lot of, I mean, there's, as I shortly mentioned in the talk, there's a lot of interest in the field of contemporary art in other ways. I mean, other knowledge, knowledge systems, non-Western knowledge system, indigenous belief systems and knowledge systems and epistemologies. And of course, this interest needs to be kind of welcomed, and is of course better than the contrary, the absence of any interest. But at the same time, you need to be careful, cautious when it comes to, quickly adapt or apply certain kind of curatorial or whatever theoretical formats and methodologies onto this interest, and to in order not to turn or convert this interest into just another kind of fashionable idea. Now we are into indigenous epistemologies, and we do this conference and do that, and invite artists to that exhibition. But to make it really into a sustainable or sustaining effort of acknowledging kind of different kinds of knowledge is also within the within the framework which is the Western art world, the still very much Western art world that only had very few and very limited approaches to non-Western cultural production, but also to non-Western knowledges, and the tendency to exoticize, to primitivize, to orientalize is still very present in the way in which there is a kind of the artist Ursula Biemann once called it, and others too called it an epistemological extractivism, which is going on with regard to indigenous knowledge systems. So my advice or my idea of an interesting of a really sustainable way of going about this would be, first, shut up and listen, and second, provide as much support and provide as much resources as possible to make accessible spaces which heretofore hadn't been accessible for indigenous and people of color, and etc. So this is a discussion going on anyway in the field, as we all know, but there's still a certain kind of paternalizing and patronizing way of doing good in this respect.
Mm-hmm. It is as if we still need a formal learning process before pursuing, or, well, not necessarily before, but that both go hand in hand. Thank you.
Yeah.
Diogo?
I don't know if there are other questions. I'd have a small one, actually. Maybe for both of you, actually, to Tom Holert and Benoit. Because during the presentation, it was a matter of locating the question of art as epistemic activity in European 20th century philosophy, so both French and German. And then you mentioned as well that the recent Documenta, which shows that the question this question of art as epistemic activity has got a momentum now. The question resurfaces. And Benoit mentioned to me that he thinks that this question is not very present in the Canadian academic world at the moment. So my question is about the geographies of that debate, actually. Mm-hmm. So who's talking about art as epistemic activity and what are the geographies of that debate at the current moment?
Benoit, would you like to respond to this?
Oh no, I will let you.
Thank you, Diogo. I think that's there's. I mean, in a way, I mean, one factor of these discussions taking place at all is the presence or absence of programs in art schools and art academies of research-based and research-based art practices. This, I mean, the entire discussion, the entire debate around the pros and cons of artistic research have kind of raised a great interest in these matters. And wherever you have these art schools and these kind of networks of practitioners interested in these questions of knowledge, there will be a certain awareness of these of the problems involved, and you can map in a way the world according to the existence or non-existence of such programs. This would be one way to do it. So in North America, for example, I don't know too much about the Canadian situation. In the US, there are popping up programs such as this here and there, not very systematically, but they do. There's also a growing interest in a more curatorial sector and in self-organized spaces, which are if they are interested in questions of pedagogy, and this is something which I know is also quite present in more alternative art worlds or parts of the Canadian art world, and but I think there is. It really depends. I mean, also the way these discussions. I mean, the kind of direction these discussions take, whether they are led or whether they are within the existing institutions or outside. So there's for one, there's the existence or non-existence of these programs, but there is of course also another discussion going on where the question of such academic offers is not that relevant, and where people are organizing increasingly around questions of epistemic politics regarding access to knowledge, people's knowledge movements, etc., which is kind of a growing concern globally, but with different emphases and different accents depending on the local situation. So there's, for example, there are strong decolonial centers, centers of decolonial discourse, decolonial thinking in South Africa, in South America, also in different places, as well as in East Coast and in university departments. So but they're differently organized. They are differently formed in a way.
Mm. Yeah, I would agree. I think the question is not if these practices and questions are in the contemporary art field. I think it is quite obvious they are everywhere. But from the Canadian perspective, I mean, of course, you mentioned the PhD programs for artists. Well, it exists at UQAM since the 90s. Also quite differently with Concordia, but it's also from the same period if we consider what is done with the humanities program, if I understand it correctly. So it's been there for a long time. I think what your question raises, Diogo, is what art historians are doing about this. Mm-hmm. Is practice-based research or art-based research considered as a valid or an accepted chapter of contemporary art history? Are there topics like research and the intertwinement between politics, epistemology, and more classically perceived art are addressed in at university in the art historical field. I think my impression is that this is something that is maybe more of an interest in Europe. That would be my hypothesis. But I mean, it's such a wide question. It's hard to offer a definitive answer, but that would be my impression.
May I recommend a recent talk, an interview that has been published on the website of the magazine Art Papers between Carrie Lambert-Beatty and Courtney McClellan, an artist. Carrie Lambert-Beatty is, as you may know, is a Yvonne Rainer scholar and also the author of an influential article on parafiction and parafictional practices from 2009 in October, and this is I mean, she seems to be, I have to get in touch with her because she seems to be in very working or being interested in things that are in close vicinity to what Knowledge Beside Itself is trying to do. She's interested in a kind of epistemological take on art, on contemporary art that is not primarily relate through kind of these classical epistemological questions of how knowledge is being understood, etc., but more about kind of a way of a kind of practical or pragmatics of knowledge, as and both on the side of the artist producer and the beholder and the receiver. And so this I think would be an interesting kind of, I mean, I'd be interested to get into a conversation with her about these questions, because this is maybe, I'm also mentioning it because it's really from the center of art history being and from a colleague, which I wouldn't consider myself to be, because I'm not, I mean, institutionally part of the art historical community in Germany.
Well, thank you for this wonderful conference and discussion. I'm just checking. Yeah, so it's 15 past 1, so I think we're gonna end it here. Diogo?
Yeah, it's perfect. Would you like to say something before we close, or?
I would like to, I mean, thank the two of you and everyone else who had been involved in making this possible again. And I'd really love to stay in touch and continue the conversation if this is of any interest, and if it is possible. And I'd also like to, I mean, at some point meet you in person, which would be great as well. So thank you, everyone.
Yeah, thank you. I would love it. I look forward to travel to Berlin, and also to discover the institute I've read about.
Yeah, please let me know when plans materialize.
And of course, you're always welcome in Montreal.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
So, thank you, Tom Holert. Thank you, Benoit Jodoin. J'aimerais juste dire que la prochaine conférence va avoir lieu le 18 février à 17h. So the next talk will take place on February the 18th at 5 p.m. And we'll welcome Denise Ferreira da Silva, who's a professor at the University of British Columbia. She's the founder and director of the Social Justice Institute. She's the author, among others, of Toward a Global Idea of Race, published in 2007, and she's also a practicing artist. Rodrigo da Alcântara, a PhD student at Concordia University, will be the discussant. So I hope to see you there, and thank you to the public as well for being present.
Thank you, Diego.
Merci.
Merci.
Thank you, merci. Bye-bye.
Au revoir.
Oh.